Subscribe to Storylab for more stories. Now, let's begin this one. Trevor Moss wasn't born into privilege. He clawed his way up from the streets of Detroit, where betrayal was currency and trust was a luxury few could afford. By 35, he'd built a modest but successful construction company, specializing in high-end custom homes for the wealthy. His hands were calloused from years of manual labor before he could afford to hire crews, and his mind was sharp from learning that in business, like in the streets, you either dominated or got dominated. He met Diana Hartwell at a charity gala 3 years ago. She was 28, blonde, beautiful, and working as an event coordinator for wealthy clients. What drew Trevor to her wasn't just her looks. It was the way she seemed genuinely impressed by his story of rising from nothing. Diana came from a comfortable middle-class family in Connecticut, but she'd always been drawn to men who had that edge, that hunger she'd never possessed. Kyle Rivera entered their lives 6 months ago when Diana hired him as a photographer for one of her events. At 32, Kyle was everything Trevor wasn't: smooth, artistic from a privileged background, but playing the struggling artist angle. He had the kind of easy charm that came from never having to fight for anything real. Diana was immediately taken with his creativity and the way he made her feel sophisticated and worldly. Trevor had noticed the change in Diana: the late nights, the secretive phone calls, the way she'd grown distant in bed. But Trevor Moss wasn't the type to confront without absolute proof. He'd learned long ago that accusations without evidence were just weakness in disguise. So he watched, and he waited, and he gathered information the way he'd learned on the streets, quietly and thoroughly. The night everything came to a head, Trevor had just returned from a business trip to Phoenix, where he'd been negotiating a major contract. He was exhausted, looking forward to a quiet evening with his wife. Instead, he walked into his own bedroom to find Diana straddling Kyle Rivera, both of them so lost in their passion they didn't hear him come in. Trevor stood in the doorway for a full 30 seconds, watching his wife of 3 years betray everything they'd built together. The rage that filled him was cold and calculating, not the hot anger of a man caught off guard, but the icy fury of someone who'd been expecting this moment and was now planning their response. When Diana finally noticed him, she didn't scramble for covers or try to hide. Instead, she climbed off Kyle with deliberate slowness and faced her husband with a defiance that Trevor had never seen before. "I'm opening our marriage," she announced, her chin raised. "If you have any problem with it, then you can leave." Kyle, meanwhile, had grabbed a sheet and was looking between Trevor and Diana with the expression of a man who'd just realized he was in deeper water than he'd expected. He'd clearly been led to believe this was going to be a simple affair, not a confrontation. Trevor's response was to turn around and walk out without saying a word. Diana called after him, something about being adults and evolving beyond jealousy, but Trevor was already moving through the house with military precision. He packed his essential belongings: clothes, important documents, cash he kept hidden, and most importantly, his laptop containing 3 years' worth of detailed financial records and business contacts. By dawn, Trevor Moss had vanished from his old life completely. He'd checked into an extended-stay hotel under a false name, using identification he'd kept from his street days. Diana could have the house, the joint accounts she knew about, and her photographer boyfriend. What she couldn't have was Trevor himself, and she was about to learn that was a more significant loss than she'd calculated. 3 days after Trevor disappeared, his phone rang with news that stopped him cold. It was Diana's sister, Rebecca, sobbing hysterically. "Trevor, thank God I reached you. Diana's dead. There was an accident. Her car went off the bridge on Highway 52. They pulled her out of the river this morning." Trevor's first emotion wasn't grief, it was suspicion. Diana was a cautious driver, almost to a fault. Highway 52 was a route she knew well, not some unfamiliar mountain road where accidents happen to good drivers. And the timing, just 3 days after their confrontation, felt too convenient. Trevor attended the funeral, playing the grieving widower while his eyes cataloged every detail. Kyle was there, playing the devastated friend, but Trevor noticed how often the man checked his phone and how his grief seemed performed rather than genuine. Diana's parents were destroyed, Her sister Rebecca was inconsolable, but something felt wrong about the entire situation. After the service, Trevor approached Rebecca privately. "I need to ask you something, and I need you to be honest with me. Did Diana seem different to you lately? Stressed about anything?" Rebecca's eyes darted away, a tell Trevor recognized from years of reading people. She mentioned some financial troubles. Said you guys were having problems, that maybe she'd have to start over somewhere new. Financial troubles? Trevor knew every penny of their shared finances, and they were comfortable. Diana had her own checking account with about $8,000, hardly enough for someone to start over anywhere significant, unless she'd found another source of income Trevor didn't know about. Trevor began his investigation the way he'd learned to handle problems in Detroit, methodically and without involving anyone he couldn't control. He drove to the accident site on Highway 52, a winding road that crossed over Miller's Creek. The guardrail was damaged, and skid marks on the asphalt told a story, but not the one the police report suggested. The skid marks were too short for someone who'd genuinely lost control. They looked more like someone who'd deliberately driven through the barrier at a specific spot. Trevor walked down to the creek bank where Diana's car had been pulled out. The water was deep enough here to submerge a vehicle completely, but shallow enough that a strong swimmer could easily make it to shore. That evening, Trevor hacked into Diana's email account using a password he'd observed her entering months ago. What he found confirmed his suspicions and revealed a plan more elaborate than he'd given his wife credit for. Diana and Kyle had been planning this for weeks. The emails detailed everything. How Diana would stage her own death, collect on a life insurance policy Trevor didn't know she'd taken out, and disappear with Kyle to start a new life in Costa Rica. Kyle had connections there through his photography work, people who could provide new identities for the right price. The plan was elegant in its simplicity. Diana would drive her car into the creek, swim to safety, and hide while Kyle collected her life insurance payout of $200,000. The policy had been purchased 8 months ago, naming Kyle as the beneficiary through a forged document claiming he was her business partner. Once the money cleared, Diana would join Kyle in Costa Rica, and they'd disappear forever. Trevor read every email twice, his anger transforming into something colder and more focused. Diana hadn't just cheated on him. She tried to steal from him and fake her own death to do it. In Trevor's world, that level of betrayal demanded a response that would be remembered. But first, he needed to confirm that Diana was still alive. Trevor spent the next week conducting surveillance with skills he'd learned during a brief stint in the military before starting his construction business. He tracked Kyle's movements, noting that the man was staying in a cabin outside of town, a property that supposedly belonged to a photography client, but was actually rented under a false name. On the 7th night after Diana's funeral, Trevor's patience was rewarded. Through binoculars, he watched Diana emerge from the cabin's back door to hang laundry on a line. She was very much alive and very much committed to her deception. Trevor smiled for the first time since this whole ordeal began. Diana and Kyle had made two crucial mistakes. They'd underestimated him, and they'd committed their crime on his territory. Now it was time to show them what happened to people who betrayed Trevor Moss. Trevor's plan was as methodical as everything else in his life, but with a brutality that reflected the man he'd been before Diana thought she could domesticate him. He started by using his construction business connections to acquire certain materials and services that wouldn't appear on any official records. First, he contacted Miguel Santos, a demolition expert who'd worked several of Trevor's projects and owed him a favor from years back. Miguel didn't ask questions when Trevor requested specific explosives and timing devices, understanding that in their world, some debts were paid in silence and blind loyalty. Next, Trevor reached out to Amy Chun, a former military communications specialist who now ran a small electronics repair shop. Amy had helped Trevor set up secure communications for his business, and she agreed to provide him with sophisticated surveillance equipment and signal jammers. Again, no questions asked. Trevor's plan would unfold in 3 phases, each designed to strip away the layers of deception Diana and Kyle had built while ensuring they faced consequences that matched their betrayal. Phase 1 began with Trevor anonymously tipping off the insurance company about Kyle's suspicious claim. He provided them with copies of Diana's emails and photos of her alive at the cabin. The insurance company immediately launched an investigation and froze the payout, trapping Kyle in a financial nightmare he couldn't escape without exposing Diana. While Kyle panicked about the frozen insurance money, Trevor moved to Phase 2. Using Amy's surveillance equipment, he documented Diana and Kyle's daily routines at the cabin, then began psychological warfare. He hired local teenagers to make anonymous calls to the cabin at all hours, breathing heavily or playing recordings of Diana's own voice, saying things like, "I know what you did." He had Miguel's crew create accidents around the cabin, small explosions in the woods, damaged power lines, mysterious fires in nearby fields. Diana and Kyle became paranoid, convinced that someone was onto them, but unable to figure out who or how much they knew. They couldn't go to the police without risking exposure, and they couldn't flee without the insurance money they counted on. Phase 3 was where Trevor's street education truly showed. He learned that the most effective revenge wasn't just punishment, it was forcing your enemies to destroy themselves. Trevor began feeding information to Diana's family, piece by piece, letting them discover the truth about their daughter's deception. He arranged for Rebecca to receive an anonymous package containing photos of Diana alive, along with copies of the insurance fraud emails. Rebecca, devastated by learning her sister had put the family through a fake funeral, became Trevor's unwitting ally in ensuring Diana faced consequences from every direction. But Trevor wasn't finished. Using his construction connections, he discovered that Kyle had been using the photography cabin for more than just hiding Diana. Kyle had been running a sophisticated identity theft operation, using his photography business to gain access to wealthy clients' homes and personal information. Trevor gathered evidence of this operation and provided it to federal authorities, ensuring Kyle would face serious criminal charges that would follow him anywhere he tried to run. The end came on a rainy Thursday night, 3 weeks after Diana's fake funeral. Trevor watched from the woods as federal agents surrounded the cabin. Diana and Kyle were arrested simultaneously, Kyle for identity theft and insurance fraud, Diana for faking her death and conspiracy to commit fraud. As the agents led them away in handcuffs, Trevor stepped out of the shadows just long enough for Diana to see him. Her face went white with shock and recognition. She screamed his name, trying to tell the agents that he was her husband, that he'd done this to them, but Trevor was already walking away. Diana's screams followed him through the trees. "Trevor, you can't do this. I'm your wife." Trevor didn't look back. In his world, she'd stopped being his wife the moment she chose betrayal. What happened to her now was simply the natural consequence of her choices. 6 months later, Kyle was sentenced to 8 years in federal prison for identity theft and insurance fraud. Diana received 4 years for her role in the conspiracy. Both would be required to pay substantial restitution to their victims, ensuring they'd emerge from prison with nothing but debt and criminal records. Trevor rebuilt his life with the same methodical precision he'd used to destroy theirs. He sold the house he'd shared with Diana, moved to a different state, and expanded his construction business into commercial projects. He never remarried, not because he couldn't find love again, but because he'd learned that some betrayals leave scars that make trust a luxury he could no longer afford. Years later, when people asked Trevor about his first marriage, he would simply say that his wife had died in an accident. In a way, that was true. The Diana he'd married had died the night she brought another man into their bed. The woman who went to prison was someone else entirely. Someone who'd learned too late that betraying Trevor Moss was a mistake that carried consequences far beyond anything she'd imagined. Trevor never forgave, and he never forgot. In his experience, people who showed mercy to betrayers were simply inviting future betrayal. He'd given Diana and Kyle exactly what they'd given him, a life-changing deception that destroyed everything they thought they could count on. The difference was that Trevor's deception served justice, while theirs had served only selfishness. And that made all the difference in the world.
This is where our story comes to an end. Share your thoughts in the comments section. Thanks for your precious time. If you enjoyed this story, then please make sure you subscribe to this channel. That would help me a lot. Click on the video you see on the screen, and I will see you there.